I always thought I was the lucky one in our family. While my sister Sarah struggled to make ends meet on her teacher's salary, I had built a successful marketing consultancy and lived in a beautiful downtown loft. But more than that, I had something Sarah didn't, a trust fund that my maternal grandparents had set up when I turned 18. It was supposed to be my safety net, my ticket to financial freedom that most people could only dream of. My mother, Linda Martinez, never let me forget how fortunate I was. "Rebecca, you have opportunities that most people would kill for," she'd remind me during our weekly Sunday dinners at her pristine suburban home. The mahogany dining table would be set with her best china, fresh flowers arranged just so, everything appearing picture-perfect to anyone looking in from the outside. Sarah would sit across from me, always dressed in her modest teacher clothes, usually something from Target or Old Navy, while I wore the designer pieces I could afford thanks to my business success. But lately, I'd started noticing how my mother's conversations always seemed to steer toward money. Specifically, my money. "Sarah's been working so hard with those children," Mom would say, cutting her pot roast with surgical precision. "You know, teaching doesn't pay what it used to. She's been looking at houses, but with these interest rates..." She'd let the sentence hang in the air like a question mark. I'd nod sympathetically because I genuinely felt for my sister. Sarah had always been the altruistic one, choosing a career in education despite knowing the financial struggles that came with it. She'd spend her own money on classroom supplies, stay late to tutor struggling students, and genuinely cared about making a difference in kids' lives. Everyone in our family, hell, everyone in our extended family, absolutely adored her for it. "I wish I could help more," Sarah would say softly, picking at her vegetables. "But you know how tight things are. Sometimes I wonder if I made the wrong career choice." "Don't you dare think that," Mom would jump in immediately. "What you do is noble, sweetheart. You're changing lives. That's worth more than any paycheck." Then her eyes would drift to me. "Some people are just blessed with different kinds of opportunities." The first crack in my perfect family facade appeared about 6 months ago during one of our typical Sunday gatherings. My Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim had joined us, along with my cousins Mike and Jenny. The conversation, as usual, had turned to Sarah's housing situation. "I just don't understand why these young people can't afford homes anymore," Aunt Carol was saying, shaking her head. "When Jim and I bought our first house, it was so much easier." "Different times," Uncle Jim agreed. "But family should help family, right?" That's what we did when Mike needed help with his down payment. I felt the weight of everyone's eyes on me. The silent expectation hung heavy in the room like humidity before a storm. "Well," Mom said carefully, "Sarah has been looking at this lovely little house in Maplewood. 3 bedrooms, perfect for a family someday. The seller is motivated, and it's exactly what she needs." "How much?" Cousin Mike asked. "300,000, Sarah replied quietly. "I have about 30,000 saved for a down payment, but the mortgage payments would still be tight." "That's where family comes in," Mom said, and I swear she looked directly at me when she said it. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. Over the following weeks, I started noticing things I'd been blind to before. The way Mom would mention Sarah's financial struggles whenever relatives were around. How she'd emphasize my good fortune and my trust fund in conversations where it really wasn't relevant. The subtle but pointed comments about generosity and family loyalty. "Your sister was telling me about this teacher who couldn't afford lunch yesterday," Mom said during one of our phone calls. "Can you imagine? Working full-time and not being able to afford a simple lunch? Thank God Sarah shares her food with colleagues like that. She has such a giving heart." "That's really sweet of her," I'd respond, and I meant it. Sarah was genuinely kind. "It just makes me think about how blessed we are," Mom would continue. "Some of us more than others, of course. I always wonder what your grandparents would think about how their gift is being used." These conversations started happening more frequently. At family barbecues, Mom would casually mention to relatives how I was doing so well financially, while Sarah was struggling but so dedicated to helping children. During coffee dates, she'd bring up articles about the housing crisis and how young teachers especially were being priced out of homeownership. The manipulation was so subtle, so wrapped in genuine concern for Sarah, that I almost didn't recognize it for what it was. Almost. The real warning sign came 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Sarah and I were having lunch together, just the two of us, which was becoming rarer as Mom seemed to orchestrate most of our family interactions. Sarah seemed nervous, playing with her salad more than eating it. "I need to tell you something," she said finally. "What's up?" "Mom's been talking to me about your trust fund." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. "What about it?" "She thinks maybe, since you're doing so well with your business, maybe you don't really need it anymore?" Sarah's cheeks flushed red. "She suggested that maybe some of it could help me with the house." I set down my fork carefully. "Sarah, that's not really how trust funds work. It's not like I can just write you a check from it." I know. I told her that. But she said she'd been doing research, and there are ways to access it for family purposes. She even talked to some financial advisor about it. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "What kind of research?" "I don't know the details. She just said that since you're financially stable, the money could do more good helping me get started." She made it sound so reasonable. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Something about Mom's research bothered me deeply. The trust fund had been set up by my grandparents, not my parents. The paperwork had been handled by their attorney, and while I'd been given copies of the basic documents when I turned 21, I'd never really studied the fine print. I'd always assumed it was straightforward. Money for me, accessible when I needed it, controlled by the designated trustees until I reached 35. But what if there were clauses I didn't know about? What if Mom had discovered something that gave her more control than I realized? The thought kept me awake until dawn. The next morning, I called the law office that had handled my grandparents' estate. It took 3 days of phone tag, but finally, I was sitting across from Richard Steinberg, the elderly attorney who had drafted the trust documents 15 years earlier. "I haven't looked at these papers in years," he said, adjusting his reading glasses as he pulled out a thick file. "Your grandparents were very specific about their wishes. Let me refresh my memory." As he read, his eyebrows slowly climbed higher on his forehead. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Oh, everything is more than okay," he said, looking up at me with something that might have been amusement. "Your grandparents were shrewder than I remembered. Tell me, has anyone in your family been making claims about accessing this fund on your behalf?" "My mother thinks she might be able to use it to help my sister buy a house." Mr. Steinberg removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "Ms. Martinez, your mother has no authority over this trust. None whatsoever. In fact, the trust was specifically designed to prevent exactly what you're describing." "What do you mean?" "Your grandparents had seen too many families torn apart by money. They built in several protection clauses. The trust cannot be accessed by anyone other than you, cannot be used for anyone else's benefit without your explicit written consent, and most importantly," he paused for effect, "any attempt by family members to coerce or manipulate you regarding the trust triggers an immediate full disbursement to you personally, along with a legal investigation into the attempted interference." I felt like I'd been struck by lightning. "They anticipated this?" "Your grandmother specifically mentioned being concerned about your mother's relationship with money. She wanted to ensure that their gift to you remained exactly that, a gift to you, not to anyone else." That had been 3 days ago. 3 days of sitting with this knowledge, watching my mother continue to drop hints about Sarah's housing situation, listening to her tell relatives about how generous our family was and how sharing is caring. Now, sitting at the Thanksgiving dinner table, surrounded by 23 of my closest relatives, I watched my mother stand up with that familiar look of maternal authority on her face. The same look she'd worn when she'd announced my engagement, my college graduation, every major milestone in my life. But this time, she was announcing something I'd never agreed to. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," Mom began, raising her wine glass. "Family is everything, and I'm so proud of the family we've built together." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Sarah looked uncomfortable, shooting me anxious glances. I kept my expression carefully neutral. As you all know, Sarah has been working so hard as a teacher, dedicating her life to educating our children. And as you also know, the housing market has been particularly difficult for young people like her. More nods. Aunt Carol made a sympathetic sound. Well, I'm pleased to announce that our family is going to help Sarah achieve her dream of home ownership. Rebecca's trust fund, the one her grandparents so generously established, is going to be used to help Sarah buy her first house. The applause started immediately. Cousin Mike whooped. Uncle Jim raised his glass. "That's what family is about," he called out. But Mom wasn't finished. Her next words hit me like a physical blow. "I know Rebecca hasn't always been as generous as she could be with her blessings," she continued, her voice taking on a slightly chiding tone. "She's been so focused on her business success that sometimes she forgets about family responsibility, but I've decided that it's time for her to step up and be the sister Sarah deserves." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to me, and I could see the mixture of expressions, some approving, some uncomfortable, some clearly waiting for my response. Sarah's face had gone completely white. "Rebecca has been blessed with so much," Mom continued, warming to her theme. "A successful business, a beautiful apartment, financial security. Meanwhile, Sarah has been struggling, choosing service over profit, choosing to make a difference in children's lives over making money. I think we all know who has made the more noble choice here." More murmurs of agreement. I felt like I was watching this happen to someone else, like I was floating above the table looking down at this surreal scene. "So I've made the decision to redirect Rebecca's trust fund toward Sarah's house purchase. The paperwork is already in motion, and Sarah should be able to close on her dream house by Christmas." The applause was thunderous this time. People were actually standing up. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. And my mother looked triumphant, vindicated, like she'd just solved world hunger. "Family takes care of family," she concluded, raising her glass higher. And it's time Rebecca learned what that really means. I sat there for a long moment, feeling the weight of 23 sets of eyes on me, some expectant, some judgmental, some sympathetic. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Then I stood up. "Before anyone drinks to that," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the dining room, "I think there are a few things about that trust fund that everyone should know." The silence that followed my words was deafening. 23 pairs of eyes stared at me as I remained standing, my hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. My mother's triumphant smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look of confusion mixed with irritation. "Rebecca, what are you talking about?" she said, her voice still carrying that maternal authority. "Sit down, honey. We're celebrating Sarah's good fortune." "No, Mom. I think everyone deserves to know the truth before they celebrate." I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. "Especially since you've made this such a public announcement." The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Sarah had gone from white to green, and she was gripping her napkin so tightly her knuckles were bloodless. "I had a very interesting conversation with Mr. Steinberg 3 days ago," I continued, looking directly at my mother. "Richard Steinberg, the attorney who drafted my grandparents' trust documents. You remember him, don't you, Mom? He handled all of Grandma and Grandpa's legal affairs." A flicker of something, fear, uncertainty, crossed my mother's face. "Rebecca, this isn't the time or place for—" "Actually, I think this is exactly the time and place." I pressed a number on my phone. "In fact, I asked Mr. Steinberg if he'd be available to join us tonight. I thought it would be helpful to have a legal expert explain exactly how trust funds work." The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Good evening, Rebecca. Are you ready for me to join the call?" "Yes, Mr. Steinberg. I'm putting you on speaker. We have the whole family here." I set the phone in the center of the table, and the elderly attorney's voice filled the dining room with crystal clarity. "Good evening, everyone. I apologize for interrupting your Thanksgiving dinner, but Rebecca felt it was important that I clarify some misunderstandings about her trust fund." My mother's face had gone ashen. "This is highly inappropriate." "What's inappropriate?" Mr. Steinberg's voice cut through her protest. "Is someone claiming to have authority over a trust that they have absolutely no legal right to access." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Uncle Jim leaned forward. What do you mean, no right to access? I mean exactly that, Mr. Steinberg replied. Mrs. Martinez, Rebecca's mother, has no authority whatsoever over this trust. None. The trust was specifically designed by Rebecca's grandparents to prevent family members from accessing or redirecting the funds without Rebecca's explicit consent. But surely as her mother, Aunt Carol began. Being Rebecca's mother gives Mrs. Martinez no legal standing regarding the trust, Mr. Steinberg continued firmly. In fact, Rebecca's grandparents were quite specific about protecting the funds from family pressure. They'd seen too many situations where well-meaning relatives caused financial conflicts. I watched my mother's face cycle through emotions: confusion, anger, embarrassment, and something that looked like panic. Sarah had put her head in her hands. Furthermore, Mr. Steinberg continued, and I knew this was the part that would change everything. The trust includes specific protection clauses. Any attempt by family members to coerce, manipulate, or pressure Rebecca regarding the funds triggers what we call a protection protocol. What kind of protocol? Cousin Mike asked. The entire trust immediately converts to Rebecca's personal assets, free and clear. Additionally, any fraudulent claims about having authority over the trust can result in legal action for financial manipulation. The silence was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in the next county. Wait, Uncle Jim said slowly. Are you saying that Linda can't actually access Rebecca's trust fund? That's exactly what I'm saying. Mrs. Martinez has no authority to make any decisions about these funds. The fact that she publicly announced she was redirecting the money without Rebecca's knowledge or consent is actually quite serious. My mother finally found her voice. I was told by a financial advisor that family members could access the funds for housing purposes. I did research. Then either you misunderstood the research or someone gave you incorrect information, Mr. Steinberg replied. May I ask who this financial advisor was? Mom looked around at the table desperately. I spoke to someone at the bank about family trust options. They said there were ways to use trust funds for family purposes. They were likely referring to trusts that include family benefit clauses, Mr. Steinberg explained patiently. Rebecca's trust is explicitly individual benefit only. Her grandparents were very clear about this. I could see the exact moment when the full reality hit my mother. Her carefully constructed narrative, the generous family matriarch redistributing wealth for the greater good, crumbled in real time. She wasn't the benevolent decision-maker she'd painted herself as. She was someone who had made public claims about money that wasn't hers to control. But I already told Sarah she could count on this, Mom whispered, and for the first time in years, she looked genuinely vulnerable. That was a promise you had no authority to make, Mr. Steinberg said gently but firmly. I'm sorry this situation has become so public and complicated. Sarah finally raised her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed and filled with tears. I'm so sorry, Rebecca. I should have known this wasn't right. I should have asked you directly instead of letting Mom handle everything. The anger I'd been carrying for months began to transform into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Sarah hadn't been the mastermind here. She'd been as manipulated as I had, just in a different way. Thank you, Mr. Steinberg, I said into the phone. I think that clarifies things for everyone. You're welcome, Rebecca. And remember, you have every right to pursue this matter further if you choose to. Publicly claiming authority over someone else's trust is not something to take lightly. After I hung up, the dining room remained silent for what felt like an eternity. The Thanksgiving feast sat cooling on the table, forgotten in the wake of what had just transpired. Uncle Jim was the first to speak. Linda, did you really think you could just take Rebecca's money? I didn't think I was taking anything, Mom said defensively, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. I thought it was family money. I thought it was the right thing to do. The right thing would have been asking Rebecca directly, Aunt Carol said quietly, not announcing it publicly like it was a done deal. And certainly not calling her selfish in front of the entire family. Cousin Jenny added, her voice sharp with disapproval. I watched my mother's face as the full scope of her actions became clear, not just to her, but to everyone in the room. She'd orchestrated a public shaming based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the facts. She'd painted me as the selfish sister hoarding wealth while Sarah struggled, and she'd done it all without having any actual authority to redistribute anything. I was trying to help Sarah, Mom said, her voice getting smaller. She's been working so hard, and Rebecca has so much. Rebecca has what her grandparents gave her, Uncle Jim interrupted. That's not the same as having too much, and it's certainly not the same as owing the rest of us anything. The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion we'd ever had. For the first time in my adult life, I heard my relatives questioning my mother's version of events. They asked about the subtle pressure campaign, the constant comments about my good fortune, the way she'd framed my financial success as somehow selfish. Cousin Mike spoke up. I remember that conversation about my down payment help. Dad and Mom offered to help me. They didn't announce they were taking money from Jenny's savings account to do it. Exactly, Jenny agreed. And they didn't call me selfish for not offering first. As the evening progressed, a clearer picture emerged. My mother had spent months building a narrative where I was the family member with too much money and too little generosity. She'd used subtle manipulation to make everyone else complicit in pressuring me to do the right thing. She'd researched just enough to convince herself she had authority she didn't possess, then made public commitments based on that false authority. But more than that, she'd fundamentally misunderstood the purpose of my grandparents' gift. The trust wasn't excess wealth that I was hoarding. It was their way of ensuring I had security and options in my life. They'd specifically designed it to protect me from exactly this kind of family pressure. Sarah, to her credit, spoke honestly about her role in everything. I was uncomfortable with the whole thing from the beginning, she admitted. But Mom made it sound so reasonable. She kept saying that Rebecca didn't really need the money, and that I was struggling so much more. But you never asked me directly, I pointed out, not accusingly, but as a statement of fact. I know. I was afraid you'd say no, and then I'd have to accept that the house just wasn't going to happen. When Mom said she could handle it, it felt like a miracle. The most painful part was watching my mother grapple with the reality of what she'd done. This wasn't malicious scheming, it was self-deception on a massive scale. She'd convinced herself that she was being the wise family matriarch, making hard decisions for the greater good. She'd believed her own narrative so completely that she'd never questioned whether she actually had the authority to make those decisions. As relatives began to leave, the evening was clearly over despite the early hour. Several stopped to apologize to me personally. Aunt Carol hugged me tightly. I'm sorry we all went along with Linda's narrative without questioning it. That wasn't fair to you. Uncle Jim shook his head as he put on his coat. I don't know what your mother was thinking, but I'm glad that lawyer was available to set the record straight. When it was just Mom, Sarah, and me left in the dining room, the full weight of the situation settled over us. The carefully set table looked ridiculous now, like a stage set for a play that had ended badly. I don't understand how this went so wrong, Mom said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It went wrong because you decided what should happen with my money without including me in the decision, I replied. And then you made it public before confirming you had any authority to do what you promised. But I really thought. You thought what you wanted to think, I said, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely clear about my relationship with my mother. You created a story where I was the problem and Sarah was the victim, and you were the solution. But none of that was based on reality. Sarah had been quiet, but now she spoke up. What happens now? I mean, I can't afford the house without help, and obviously the trust fund was never really an option. It was a fair question. The house she'd been counting on was still out of reach. The financial pressure that had started this whole mess was still real. Now you figure out what you can actually afford, I said, like everyone else does when they want to buy a house. But she's been counting on this, Mom protested weakly. She was counting on something that was never real, I replied. That's not my fault, and it's not my responsibility to fix. The words felt harsh even as I said them, but they were true. Sarah's financial situation was challenging, but it wasn't my emergency to solve. My grandparents hadn't left me a trust fund so I could bail out family members. They'd left it so I could have security and choices in my own life. Over the following days, I had to rebuild my understanding of my family relationships from the ground up. Phone calls with relatives who wanted to understand what had really happened, conversations with Sarah about our relationship moving forward, and eventually, a long, difficult discussion with my mother about boundaries and respect. The most surprising thing was how liberated I felt. For months, I'd been carrying guilt about my financial success and my selfishness regarding family money. I'd been questioning my own values, wondering if I really was as generous and caring as I'd always believed myself to be. But the truth was simpler and cleaner. I wasn't responsible for solving my adult sister's financial problems, especially not with money that my grandparents had specifically designated for my security. Being financially successful didn't obligate me to bankroll other people's dreams, even family members' dreams. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, Sarah found a smaller house in a different neighborhood, one she could actually afford on her teacher's salary with a modest down payment. She was disappointed that it wasn't the house she'd originally wanted, but she was also relieved to be making decisions based on reality rather than false promises. "I think I got caught up in wanting something that was beyond my means," she told me when she called to share the news. "And I let Mom convince me that I deserved help rather than accepting what I could actually manage." Mom and I began rebuilding our relationship too, but on completely different terms. The days of her making decisions about my life, even small ones, were over. The days of guilt trips about my financial choices were over. The days of me apologizing for my success were definitely over. "I really thought I was helping," she said during one of our first post-Thanksgiving conversations. "I know you did," I replied, "but help requires asking first, not assuming, and it definitely doesn't require publicly shaming someone to motivate them to do what you think they should do." The trust fund remained exactly what my grandparents had intended it to be: my security, my choice, my decision about when and how to use it. Mr. Steinberg had been right about the protection clauses. My grandparents had anticipated exactly this kind of family pressure and had built in safeguards to prevent it. 6 months later, as I sat in my office reviewing the quarterly reports for my consulting business, I reflected on how much had changed since that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. My relationship with my family was healthier, built on honesty rather than obligation. Sarah was happily settled in her affordable house, proud that she'd managed the purchase on her own terms, and Mom was learning to ask rather than assume when it came to my decisions. The trust fund remained untouched, exactly as my grandparents had intended. Not because I was hoarding wealth, but because I understood now what they'd really given me: not just money, but the freedom to make my own choices without family pressure or manipulation. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't what someone gives you, but how they protect your right to choose what to do with it. My grandparents had given me both the security of financial resources and the protection to use them according to my own values and timeline. That, I realized, was the real truth about the fund, and the real reason my mother's public announcement had backfired so spectacularly. You can't redistribute someone else's freedom, no matter how good your intentions might be.